Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Richard Fontaine. I'm the president of the Center for New American Security. It's a real pleasure to welcome you today to this presidential campaign surrogate debate. It's a special collaboration among the American Enterprise Institute, the Center for New American Security, and the New America Foundation. This event is the sixth in a series that our three institutions have held throughout 2012, each of them aimed at informing the national security debate during the presidential campaign. We've held sessions on covering America's overall role in the world, on the defense budget, the Asia Pacific, the Middle East, and several weeks ago we held a surrogate debate at Arizona State University. Today we meet at a time when foreign policy has returned to the center of the conversation between the candidates. I am therefore very pleased to introduce our two campaign representatives, Rich Verma from the Obama campaign and Dov Zakheim from the Romney campaign. Rich Verma is currently a partner at Steptoe & Johnson, where he works on matters of national security law and international regulation. He most recently served in the Obama administration as the Assistant Secretary of State for Legislative Affairs. Earlier in his career, Rich served as the Senior National Security Advisor to the Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, and prior to that worked in the House of Representatives for the National Democratic Institute and as an officer in the Air Force Judge Advocates General Corps. Dov Zakheim is a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Previously, he was senior vice president of Booz Allen Hamilton. During the Bush administration, Dov was Undersecretary of Defense and Chief Financial Officer or Comptroller for the Department of Defense. And he's had several other Pentagon posts during his career and is the author of over a dozen books. Joining me in moderating the debate today are Peter Bergen of the New America Foundation and Tom Donnelly of the American Enterprise Institute. I'd note that the event today is being live streamed on CNN.com, and I'd note also that you can find materials related to the event and to the elections on the websites of our three organizations, including a national security guide to the presidential election on the CNAS website. So we'll proceed today as follows. Each of the campaign representatives will offer a brief opening statement of several minutes, which will be followed by questions from the moderators, and then we'll open up the floor to Q&A from the audience. And with that, let me turn it over to Rich for his statement.
Richard, thank you very much. And let me thank CNAS for the invitation to be here, for the work that you do on national security. And it's quite a tribute to the organization to get such a big crowd. I understand there's a baseball game going on at the same time. Folks must be here for the fancy lunches they have on their tables. But seriously, the briefing papers and the conferences that you do really contribute so much to the policy debate at a critical time. Let me also, 4 months late, congratulate you on your ascendancy to the presidency of CNAS and giving many former Senate staffers hope for the future. There is life beyond the Senate. And let me also say it's an honor to be here with Dov Zakheim, someone with really so many years of distinguished service to the country. I'm also very proud to be here on behalf of the President's re-election campaign to talk about his record on national security and to highlight some of the major differences between the President and Governor Romney. Over the past 4 years, the President has amassed a strong record on foreign policy and security. He's dealt with foreign crises, taken strong action against those who threaten U.S. interests, and has seized the opportunities presented by democratic openings in the Middle East and beyond. Proven himself to be a tough and smart commander-in-chief who has remained steady in the face of adversity. Under the president's leadership, Al-Qaeda has been decimated. The Iraq war has been ended with honor. U.S. forces in Afghanistan have begun a critically important transition. Iran has never been more isolated, and the Libyan people have a chance to reclaim their freedom following the removal of Muammar Gaddafi from power. The President has shored up the nation's homeland defenses, redoubled the commitment to America's veterans, stood up for human rights across the globe, supporting democratic reform efforts abroad and ending torture here at home. U.S. security assistance is at an all-time to Israel is at an all-time high. And in the face of a difficult fiscal situation, he's put the military on a path to remain the best trained, best equipped, and best led fighting force in history. Governor Romney's foreign policy positions, and there are many, can be tough to follow if you don't keep close track. He likes to talk about the confidence, clarity, and resolve in his foreign policy, when in fact it's been more confusion, dysfunction, and division. The reality is that Governor Romney has been searching for a foreign policy narrative and position and worldview since the campaign started. His positions seem to bob and weave depending upon which advisors are speaking to him or where the polls might be going. On Libya, as near as I can tell, the governor has had 5 different positions. Monday's speech at VMI may count as a 6th. The one definitive step that he did take was to hold a press conference hours after the death of the U.S. ambassador there. Before the facts were known, before all the families were notified, the governor, sensing a political opening, took to the airwaves to condemn U.S. embassy staff in Cairo. He's been trying to play cleanup ever since, and Monday's speech was no different. On Afghanistan, after complaints and outrage about the president's timeline for transition, Governor Romney did the unthinkable. He set a timeline for transition, which coincidentally happens to track with the president's. Governor Romney said on Monday, quote, "I will pursue a real and successful transition to Afghan security forces by the end of 2014. Maybe it's the modifiers real and successful that make his position so different. On Mideast peace, when the governor in private remarks, now infamous remarks, wrote off 47% of the public, he also came out against a 2-state solution, saying, quote, "It's going to remain an unsolved policy." And, quote, "The Palestinians were committed to the destruction of Israel." Yet in Monday's speech, he claimed he would, quote, "recommit America to the goal of a democratic Palestinian state." To call that a flip or a flop would be charitable. And when the positions are not shifting, the governor appears either stuck in the past, such as when he called Russia our #1 geopolitical foe, or so far outside even the Republican mainstream, such as when he vehemently opposed the New START Treaty, a position that put him at odds with Kissinger, Hadley, Rice, Scowcroft, President George H.W. Bush, and the entire senior military leadership. Let me just make a few closing comments about some subjects that have been in the news, including Iran, the Arab Spring, and defense spending. On Iran, we hear a lot of saber rattling and increasingly loud rhetoric from the Romney campaign. But when you look at the details of their position, it appears to be the same as the president's. Crippling sanctions, all options on the table, increased assets in the Gulf. The difference is that the president was able to get the allied cooperation that is so essential to fully isolate and hit Iran with the toughest possible sanctions. One senior Romney advisor said on Monday, when asked what is different about the Romney position on Iran, he said, quote, "We disagree with the president's approach to working with allies." Given this rejection of international cooperation, does anyone really believe a President Romney could have gotten the EU, the South Koreans, or the Japanese to implement an oil embargo from Iran? On the Arab Spring, the governor likes to paint a Mideastern turmoil with capitals burning, but he always fails to note the progress of moderate forces in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, and even in Yemen. We don't know his strategy for supporting these moderate forces. What we get are slogans: peace through strength, America must lead, America is exceptional, all true, no doubt. We even hear whispers of returning to the dictators of the past. But we get very little detail. We get very little vision of how he would do things differently. We do know that if Congressman Ryan's budget was actually implemented, we would see a 30% reduction in the diplomatic and development budget used to support the people the governor says he wants to stand with. And finally, on defense cuts, perhaps the biggest straw man that the governor has set up, the governor says, quote, he'd like to roll back President Obama's deep and arbitrary cuts to our national defense that would devastate our military. Let's all remember that these cuts to the Pentagon's growth were part of the Budget Control Act and supported by Congressman Ryan and Republican leaders in Congress. Congressman Ryan even said, this is finally the legislation that we have been waiting for. And his proposal for defense spending would cost some $2 trillion over 10 years. That's $2 trillion in additional spending. This is spending the Pentagon hasn't asked for, and it's also spending that isn't paid for. I know Big Bird's gotten a lot of attention lately, but that one offset couldn't possibly yield enough to pay for the collection of new ships, planes, and troops. But even more troubling, there's been no discussion about what the strategy is that the increased spending is designed to support. Are the additional funds to support a two-front war, to combat perhaps his number one geopolitical foe, to engage in long-term stability operations and nation building? The answer is we don't know. And the governor's speeches haven't shed any light on key fundamental questions about security, about America's role in the world, about American power, and how we should stand up for the moderate forces fighting for freedom and aspirations across the Middle East. These aren't trick questions. These are fundamental questions about the world and questions that most Americans expect a future commander-in-chief to have answered and resolved. I look forward to taking your questions.
All right, thank you very much. And Dov.
Well, thanks very much. I share with Rich my thanks to all three of you and your organization. Well, let me try again. Can you hear me now? No. Anti-Republican meeting. How about now? Have I shamed them into turning on the mic? Actually, all I was doing was thanking these guys. And I share with Rich one thing. I think Democrats and Republicans both care very much about this country and about our role in the world. We differ about how we get there. And the differences really are deep. I agree with Rich on that as well. Let me begin with defense, something I know something about, I think. And that is the sequester. Now, we know that Mr. Panetta, our Secretary of Defense, has said the sequester would be a disaster, as it would be. And I refer you to him for chapter and verse about the size of the Navy, the size of the Air Force, the size of the Army. Where did that originate? Where did that idea come from? Turns out it came from the White House. Turns out Mr. Jack Lew had a meeting with Senator Reid and Congresswoman Pelosi and suggested this. And initially, apparently, they weren't too keen on the idea till defense was thrown in. Now, how much does defense really amount to, percentage-wise, in terms of the problem we as a nation face? If you talk about given budgetary spending every year, discretionary spending, defense is pretty nigh on 50%. If you talk about the real problem, which includes entitlements, defense is 14%. If you then look at the $55-odd billion coming out of the sequester, that works out to about 1.4% of our overall problem, but better than 10% of the defense budget. Now, are you going to tell me that the solution to our national financial problems is cutting defense? And oh, by the way, do you honestly think that the mullahs in Iran, that the North Koreans, that the radical Muslims, including Al-Qaeda, which supposedly has been defeated, but now turns out to have been part, if not all of, behind the attack on our ambassador, the murder of our ambassador in Benghazi and 3 of his colleagues? Do you honestly think they pay attention to our budget numbers other than hoping they keep on going down? So then what are we talking about here? We're talking about an administration that talks about a pivot to Asia and cutting budgets at the same time. Of course the Pentagon went along with it. When did the Pentagon not go along with its commander-in-chief? That doesn't prove a thing. Let's go around the world and have a look at how well we really are doing. Oh, we're doing very well in the Arab Spring. How many embassies were attacked? How many demonstrations have been held against us? Our great friends in Egypt, President Morsi lays conditions down in an interview with the New York Times as to when he'll have good relations with the United States. This by a man who's still getting hundreds of millions of dollars of aid from the United States. In England, they call it cheek. In French, they call it chutzpah. We have been behind on the Arab Spring all the way from the beginning. We've made a virtue of leading from behind. Libya is supposed to be our showpiece. And we've had the first ambassador killed in the line of duty since the years of Jimmy Carter. What does that tell you? We have a president of Egypt who basically is thumbing his nose at us. And then there's the relationship with Israel, which is supposed to be so good that the President of the United States has to say to the President of France over an open mic what he really thinks about the Prime Minister of Israel. And then when the Prime Minister of Israel says, look, we need a credible red line with the Iranians, the President dismisses that as noise. Now, if you're Prime Minister of Israel, you're going to worry about the existence of your country. And there are many ways to deal with that, including having some kind of red line, or at least arranging with the Israelis privately what the red line would be, being credible with the Iranians. How can you be credible about sanctions when you've let 20 countries off the hook, including China and India? Those are really credible sanctions. And everybody knows that the congressional sanctions are the ones that are foisted upon the administration, not the other way around. The president finally signed off the other day on a new round of sanctions that were passed months ago. So what do we mean when we say we're being tough on sanctions, or that Mr. Romney is not going to be tough? All he has to do to show that he's tougher is close the loopholes that already exist. How do you pivot to Asia when your forces go down? And oh, by the way, if you do pivot to Asia that way, what will be left in the Middle East? How credible will you be with the Iranians? Anything we do has to be both credible and enforceable. Right now, our position on Iran is neither. And now let's look at Syria, which has started basically a low-level war with Turkey that could really get worse. Where are we? Our administration sits on its hands. It says, well, we don't really know who the good guys are in the Free Syrian Army and among the other rebels, so we can't do very much about it. This is the same intelligence community that's supposed to tell us, by the way, how close Iran is going to be to a bomb. If we don't even know in a more open society, which is what Syria is right now, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, how are we going to know when Iran is on the verge of having a bomb, which is exactly what scares Prime Minister Netanyahu? If they're 3 weeks away, 4 weeks away, 5 weeks away, how are we going to know it? We don't even trust our own intelligence on Syria. This is an administration that boasts about trade and its openness to the world. Do you know how many trade agreements we've reached that were started by this administration? 0. Goose eggs. What we want the Nationals to do against their opponents today from St. Louis. Pardon me, all of you Cardinal fans. I'm an Oriole fan anyway. We have started none. We completed 3 started by the Bush administration: South Korea, Panama, Colombia. And that took a lot of teeth pulling. Do you know how many China has reached in the last 4 years? 9. 5 more being negotiated. What does that tell you about our position on trade? What it really tells you is where the unions are on trade. Now, the argument is made, Mr. Romney doesn't really understand international relations because of what he said about Russia. Well, look at the administration's track record on Russia. The reset has gone nowhere. The computer has shut down. Mr. Putin knows only one thing, and that's strength. Classic czarist policy. If there's strength, they'll deal with you. If there's weakness, they'll walk all over you. which is why Russia continues to support Assad no matter how many people he kills. Russia wanted us to walk away from our ballistic missile defense program. We don't want to do that. That was the reason why so many people, myself included, opposed the latest New START deal, because there is too much ambiguity about that missile defense program. Ambiguity doesn't work with Russia. Clarity does. In fact, ambiguity doesn't work with anybody. Only clarity does. And unfortunately, this administration is wonderful with words. I'll be the last person to deny that President Obama is terrific with words, at least when he's giving speeches. But when it comes to actions, we undermine ourselves. We have very little credibility. Yes, it's true. Most Europeans would vote for Mr. Obama as President of the United States. But that's the equivalent of saying that most Americans love the Queen and therefore we should become a monarchy. It's irrelevant. What's relevant is what this administration has done for our country relative to other countries, relative to our friends, whom we tend to dismiss, and our enemies, whom unfortunately we have misled into believing that they can walk all over us. That's why we need a change. We need it now. We need it in the interest of our country. We need it in the interest of the free world. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dov. Now let's begin with some questions to both of the panelists. And Rich, why don't I start with you? To go back to the point about Syria, the Syrian conflict has killed more than 20,000 people and displaced hundreds of thousands. Governor Romney has called for arming the Syrian rebels to help them in their efforts to topple the government. Why not arm the rebels or take more forceful steps?
Yeah, so I think it's important to note what Governor Romney actually said in his speech. It was a bit of a head fake after months of saying that we, the United States, should arm the Syrian rebels. It was a clever word choice in the speech where it actually said they should be armed, and then took a step back as to who should actually do it, how it would be done. Still doesn't like to answer the questions about what kinds of arms, who they would go to, and the risk that they could fall into extremist groups, or frankly, the risk that they could threaten our ally, Israel. The United States has been incredibly engaged and active in Syria with rebel forces under the president's leadership. It's an incredibly difficult situation. We've provided logistical support, communication support, worked with our allies, worked with Turkey, tried to support, provided as much humanitarian aid as we can. But if anyone who speaks to the U.S. ambassador on this question, still the calculation is that providing lethal support from the United States into the rebels' hands at this time would have a very uncertain outcome. And so we are working very hard with the rebel forces. And clearly, as the president said, Assad's days are over, and they will eventually come to an end. And so we need to be ready to support those, provide as much support to those moderate forces as we can in the interim. I do want to, if I can, just say one thing about Dov's comments about Iran, which is also very related to the Syria issue. And he does set up the straw man about the sanctions on Iran and the 20 countries that have gotten off the hook. I think it is interesting to note that this is where facts really do matter. The Iran Sanctions Act is the critical piece of legislation that the Congress passed in the 90s to punish Iran and its and for those who support its petroleum sector. 0 companies were sanctioned by the Bush administration under the Iran Sanctions Act in 8 years. 0. When the president came to office, he very aggressively moved on sanctions using existing Treasury Department authorities. He then worked with the Congress almost immediately to sign a new comprehensive piece of legislation, of which multiple companies across the world, including Chinese companies, including Russian companies, have been sanctioned. The 20 exemptions that Dov likes to talk about were a wholly different piece of authority, which granted the president the authority to exempt countries that made substantial reductions in their oil imports from Iran. South Korea, in fact, cut off their imports. Turkey reduced. India reduced. In fact, China reduced. So it was specifically targeted at the banking sector. This Congress authorized the exemption. These 20, leaving 20 countries off the hook. In fact, we have made crippling sanctions. And when I hear the other side talk about, we're really gonna do this on our own, we have had an embargo against Iran for 30 years. The fact is, for crippling sanctions, you do need international cooperation, and the kind of saber-rattling and do-it-alone approach we have seen, and we have seen that it will not be very effective in constraining the mullahs in Iran that Dov is so concerned about.
Dov, can I ask you to respond to the Iran point, but also on the Syria point?
Absolutely.
What about the weapons falling into the wrong hands, and should the U.S. itself be providing those weapons?
See, I don't get it. Maybe I'm just dumb. But if we're working with these folks on communications, on logistics, we're working with them every day, we're engaged with them, your words, why do we know who the good guys are? I mean, who are we communicating with? The bad guys? Are we providing logistics to the bad guys? Then we're really nuts. So we must be working with the good guys. Well, then why can't we provide them with arms? Or at least provide the money for them to buy arms? Or at least work with other of our Arab friends to get the arms to these people? I don't get it. It doesn't add up. Either you're engaged or you're not engaged. If you're engaged, you sure as heck better know who you're engaged with. Doesn't work out terribly well when you get engaged to somebody you don't know. And if you know who they are, why aren't you helping them out when they're crying out for it? Oh, Assad's going to fall. You know how long we've been saying that now? How many thousands will it take before Assad falls? How many thousands of dead and injured and wounded, men, women, children? And we're saying he's going to fall. Yeah, in the long run, we're all dead. Doesn't prove a thing. It just highlights the inconsistency of what the administration is saying. I couldn't have said it better than the way it was just said. On Iran, working with the Congress. Of course they worked with the Congress, because they had to. Congress forced these sanctions on them. And yes, there's been a reduction in oil imports, but the whole idea is to zero out oil imports. That has not happened. And the question is, why not? Mr. Romney has said, I want to zero out the oil imports. Now, the other point, we're going to do it on our own? He's never said we're going to do it on our own. On the contrary, what Mr. Romney has said is, we're going to work with our allies in a way that this administration is not. He doesn't plan to wake up the Polish foreign minister in the middle of the night to tell him we've just changed our missile defense plans. He doesn't plan to go and whisper to the president of France that Mr. Netanyahu is a pain you know where. He doesn't plan to turn around to the Russian president and say, just wait, once I have flexibility, I can do all kinds of things that I can't do right now. He doesn't plan to stand aside when there's a major green revolution in Iran and the United States does nothing. We're supposedly trying to get the mullahs to heal to what we're looking for, and at the same time, the very same mullahs know that when there was a real threat to them, we sat on our hands. What does that tell you about our credibility? What does that tell you about our consistency?
Dov, you've written a book about Afghanistan. You were the point person at DOD on the Afghan account during the George W. Bush administration. Governor Romney mentioned, of course, the 2014 drawdown in his Monday speech. What he didn't talk about in that was the strategic partnership agreement that the administration has negotiated with the Afghan government, which will keep American soldiers in Afghanistan until 2024. Do you have a sense of what the minimum number of soldiers should be going forward?
Well, let me clarify a couple of things, because there are more than a few former administration folks here who will say Zakheim was not the total point man on Afghanistan. I was involved, but I share the credit with many, many others who probably had more influence than I did. The first point I'd like to make about Afghanistan and the big difference between Mr. Romney and Mr. Obama is that Mr. Obama set a deadline, period, full stop. I was in Kabul in December of 2009 when Mr. Obama made that speech. And I was talking to ISAF people, the people from the international force, you know, the people who are out there getting shot at from other countries, not just our own. To a man and a woman, because there were a lot of women there, they all almost took no notice of the surge statement. What they noticed was the deadline. What our Pakistani friends have noticed is the deadline. What the Taliban has noticed is the deadline. And everybody is playing to that deadline, including President Karzai, quite frankly, who has no other choice. What Mr. Romney has said is, yes, that works as long as the military thinks it works. If you trust the commanders on the ground and they say, we can't leave just yet, then you're going to change your plan. And the Taliban is terrified of that. The last thing they need is to know that the United States may not leave as quickly as they expect. And look what happened in Iraq. Boy, we stuck to our deadline. And we didn't work all that hard to make sure there was a SOFA, Status of Forces Agreement, with Iraq. And look at Iraq today, with a man who is trying very hard to become a Shia dictator, with civil war breaking out again, with Al-Qaeda active not only in Iraq but in Iraq's neighbors. So how well have we done? Have we brought peace and democracy to Iraq? Are the Iraqi people safe? The answer we know is no. So the difference is, Mr. Romney says, and this goes to the question, I don't want to evade it, how many troops? How many troops will depend on the situation on the ground? What you don't want to have is an announcement ahead of time. We will have X number of troops for Y number of years, and let the Taliban plan against that. Because if we announce what we're going to do, it's like telegraphing in basketball. The best way to get the other team to steal your ball is if you telegraph your pass.
But just to follow up on that, the fact that the administration is negotiating an agreement that would last till 2024 is presumably something that you're personally happy about.
Well, it depends on the nature of the agreement, number one. It depends whether the next president of Afghanistan upholds it. The devil's always in the details. I mean, we thought we were going to have an arrangement where we would have some troops staying in Iraq. It didn't happen.
But that's because the Iraqi parliament wouldn't allow it.
Well, but that's the whole point. You don't know how things play out until they actually do. I don't know how the Afghan parliament will behave. I don't know how a president in 2017, a president of Afghanistan, will behave. Until something is finalized, it's just words. Again, I come back to my fundamental point. We have had 4 years of words, big words, little words, words.
Just on that, I mean, we've had a lot of tough talk from the other campaign, and it does remind us of what we lived through for 8 years with a lot of tough talk, with 200,000 troops in the Middle East, hunkered down, unable to pivot to Asia or anywhere else, frankly, while the Iranian regime was getting stronger, spinning centrifuges, because we could do nothing else. And it seems to me that is exactly the strategy that the governor has us headed towards again. War in Syria, war in Iran, some untold thousands of numbers of troops in Iraq, an unlimited presence for who knows when and how many troops in Afghanistan. What about that would actually make us safer and stronger in this new threat environment is very curious. I think it does have something to do with as I started, with the vision that the governor has. If your vision of what's happening in the world is driven by Russia as your geostrategic threat, and you want to confront China on day one, and you want to confront the states, and you want to be hunkered down in the Middle East while these transnational threats and sub-state actors are hitting us very hard, then that's a totally different approach, I agree. But if you want to be where the president has been, which is very aggressive against al-Qaeda, supporting the democratic and moderate forces, doing the transitions in Afghanistan and Iraq, frankly, to lighten our burden in the Middle East so we could move and confront other threats in the world. It is a faster, it is a more agile, it is a smarter, tougher, and stronger approach. One only has to look at the previous administration. If that's what people want in their security posture going forward, they can have it again, because it sounds that's exactly what Dov is suggesting.
But just to follow up briefly on that, is Al-Qaeda largely defeated in your view, Rich?
No, of course not. But I will, you can look at the testimony, or public comments of John Brennan, other administration officials, that the core of Al-Qaeda has been decimated. The senior leadership ranks have been decimated. What we have to guard against is the affiliate groups and the extremist groups, but even the core affiliates, the senior leadership ranks of core affiliates, have been taken out as well. Whether the governor or Dov would like to admit it or not, there is a battle taking place across the Middle East. It is a battle of ideas. We can't kill and capture our way out of this battle. We have to support the moderate forces. We have to help our allies defeat extremism. You do that through strength and power. You do that through diplomacy. You do that through development. The governor's approach and Dov's approach, as far as I can tell, is to put everything on the backs of a U.S. soldier and say, go get them. And again, we've seen that approach, and he likes to bring up Iraq. If Iraq is really what you want to run on as the signature kind of way to transact business in the Middle East, the governor is free to do that. But the fact is, I don't think the American people want to replicate that experience again.
Look, I guess you can keep on running against George W. Bush forever. But that's not what Governor Romney's talking about.
They're the same ideas.
I look at Governor... No, they're not the same ideas. Thank you for saying that, because now I can rebut you. Look at Governor Romney. What has Governor Romney said about his defense budget? What does he want to increase? Ships. 15 ships a year. 3 submarines a year. Very, very different from going into Iraq or going into Iran. We are convinced that the only way to stop the Iranians is not to go and invade a country that large, but to be credible about what you're going to do, about your sanctions, about your relationship with the Israelis. When the Iranians see us quarreling with the Israelis, they conclude we're not going to do anything. When the Iranians see us giving people exemptions, I don't care how you want to word it. An exemption is an exemption is an exemption. If it quacks like one, if it walks like one, it looks like one. When they see those exemptions, they conclude weakness. They conclude lack of credibility. That's what we're talking about. We're not a bunch of warmongers. Nobody has said go and invade anybody. Quite the contrary. And peace through strength, which, as you know, the governor repeats quite frequently, was Ronald Reagan's theme. And Ronald Reagan didn't go to war with the Soviets. He actually was the one that convinced the Soviets that it was pointless to go to war with us or to try to outbuild us. The real issue here is how credible is the United States going to be? You want to pivot to Asia, you want to cut the defense budget, you tell me how those two add up, because I can't figure it out.
Let me follow up on the Iran point for just a moment and ask both of you, what should the ultimate objective of U.S. policy in Iran be? Should it be a non-nuclear Iran? Should it be regime change? Can we live with this government in Iran if it's not pursuing a nuclear weapon?
Yeah,
Rich,
the president has said that we'd not accept Iran with a nuclear weapon. Now, there are a lot of other issues on the agenda with Iran, support for international terrorism, cracking down on its people, but it seems to me of the issues that we're most focused on. Among many, it is the nuclear issue and preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon. Now, the governor has taken a multitude of positions on Iran, including agreeing with the president that was exactly the position that he should take, and then changing it and taking a bit of an evolving position on Iran. I do want to come back to a couple things that Dov said about defense spending, though, and it is interesting this kind of story about Jack Lew coming up with the sequester. I mean, I don't think you were in the room for that, Dov, as far as I can tell, and it's an interesting interesting story to tell, especially when you go back and if someone could just do a Google search for the number of Republican leaders that stood up for sequester and said what an important tool this is. And no one thinks it should come into effect. I mean, it was never supposed to come into effect. And frankly, the vice presidential candidate, Congressman Ryan, supported the sequester and the Budget Control Act and the cuts that Dov says are so devastating. But you would also agree that fiscal strength is probably important abroad as well, and economic strength. And I don't know how an additional $2 trillion in spending on defense that is unpaid for, with the additional assets that you're talking about, that no one in the Pentagon has asked for, except perhaps the former advisors that now serve on the campaign. I mean, it is an amazing thing to pick a number and then build a campaign around it instead of designing a strategy of which you then build a defense philosophy around that.
Well, first on Iran, the fact that Mr. Romney actually agrees that the priority is stopping Iran from having a nuclear weapon shows that ultimately both President Obama and Mr. Romney recognize the threat that Iran poses. The issue is, where do you go from there? Fine, it's your priority. How do you deal with it? It's no good to say what President George W. Bush may or may not have done 8 years ago, 7 years ago, 6 years ago. That is not a prescription for the future. You keep looking back, you'll get a stiff neck. The real issue is, how do you get the Iranians to stop enrichment? If you wait until they're a month away or 6 weeks away and then say, I'm going to rely on my intelligence, I repeat, our intelligence doesn't allow us to pick out who are the good guys and bad guys in Syria. Our intelligence didn't tell us that, well, actually they did tell us that there was going to be trouble in Libya and Egypt, but we ignored the intelligence. And that's still coming out. There's a hearing today about it. Pat Kennedy's testifying about it. So even if we get the intelligence, that doesn't mean we're going to pay attention to it. How far do you want to risk that? What Mr. Romney is saying, I don't want to take that kind of risk. I share with the president the concern about Iran getting a nuclear weapon, but I'm going to go about preventing that in a very different way. Now, since you want to talk about the budget, I'm perfectly happy to do that. Mr. Liu is quoted in Bob Woodward's book. Last time I've checked, nobody has challenged that. Nobody. Partly because people in the White House talked to Bob Woodward, so how are they going to challenge what they said? The fact is that the President of the United States has sat on his hands when it has come to resolving the fiscal crisis. He keeps kicking it over to the Congress. Whether you agree with Simpson-Bowles or you don't agree with Simpson-Bowles, this was a group of people that came up with a bipartisan solution. Where was the president? Where has the president been on all of this, other than saying, I'm going to veto any attempt to prevent defense from being included in the sequester? In other words, holding defense hostage to the ideology that we cannot touch entitlements. The sequester goes after, let me put it this way, 2% of the sequester addresses entitlements. 2%. That works out very nicely if you buy into that ideology. It does not work out very nicely if you're concerned about defense. And oh, by the way, the $2 trillion spend, we're trying just to get to the Gates baseline budget. And the last time I checked, Bob Gates wasn't just a Republican appointee.
This seems like a good time to explore the defense issues a little bit more thoroughly, both the budget and the military reforms or military changes associated with the pivot. But to begin with the budget part, it does seem a little disingenuous to say that these are dollars and programs that the Pentagon hasn't asked for, when as recently as 2011 they were in the Obama budget. So they were asked for programs during the Obama administration, and they've been cut and taken away since the president took power. The second part of that question is, in the jockeying over the sequester, does the commander-in-chief play a fundamentally different role than any of the other actors in the melodrama? Does he have a different constitutional set of responsibilities than the others? And finally, for Dov, you alluded to the fact that in dollar terms, the defense increases are relatively modest in comparison to the overall spending reforms that are necessary to reach the governor's target of 20% of federal spending overall for all federal programs. That probably means pretty substantial cuts in entitlement spending. So if one is dependent upon the other, how does the governor intend to, within the time, the space of a single administration, make such a substantial and drastic change in government spending?
So I think this is a place where facts really do matter. And just to remind people, the base budget for this year is about $525 billion, which is up 34% since 2001. I mean, the notion that somehow this budget has been cut, even compare the base budget of FY13 to 2007 under George H.W. Bush. Under his last budget, it's gone up considerably. And defense will continue to go up under this administration. And it's projected to go up into FY20. The question is controlling the rate of growth, and that's where the Congressman Ryan, Speaker Boehner, bipartisan group all decided that there should be cuts to the growth. Just again, some of the facts, talk about naval assets. Our Navy is bigger than the next 13 navies combined. By FY20, we'll have 300 ships. That's the projection. Again, their plan is in search of a strategy. 60% of those assets are to be deployed to the Pacific by 2020. The Air Force is going to have roughly the same amount of planes by 2017, but significantly more platforms, significantly more capabilities. This notion of counting, ships that we had in 1916 versus ships that we have in 2011 or projected to have in 2020 is slightly ridiculous, given the incredible capabilities that our forces, that our ships and our weapon systems now have, and the speed and lethality in which they operate. So, it's one thing to say, Dov says, we should listen to the military when it comes to Afghanistan, but we shouldn't listen to the military when it comes to our budget. And we shouldn't listen to the military when it comes to New START. Fact is, General Dempsey said this is not a budget. This is a budget that will support our military needs. Testified very proudly on behalf of this budget. So picking and choosing when you decide to listen to the military is an interesting tactic.
I'll try to answer your question. Obviously, there will have to be adjustments to entitlement spending. There's no question about that. Remember, Mr. Romney also believes that he's going to be able to stimulate the economy. So the economy will grow, which means receipts will go up. He's also said that he's going to deal with tax loopholes. I am not a tax expert, but it seems to me that there are an awful lot of those loopholes, and that will help. And again, when we're only talking about essentially 1.4% of the entire problem, it seems a doable do to fix it. And you can't fix it in 1 year, you can fix it in 4 years for sure. So at least I'm trying to answer your question. Now, I can't just sit back and listen to some of this stuff and be told, in effect, well, facts matter, but you, Dov, you just don't know any facts. First of all, one little fact. I really wonder whether Mr. Panetta, who talked about the smallest number of ships since 1915, sent that in a letter to your former boss, Senator McCain, would really be happy to hear that his argument is ridiculous. It wasn't a Republican who made that case. It was Mr. Panetta. Number one. Number two, the Navy is going to be bigger because I funded the ships. that are being built, it takes a few years to get them out to sea. Look at the pattern of naval spending and the number of ships over the next few years. The Air Force. Rich was very careful to talk about platforms, not aircraft. Why? Because he's talking about drones, not just planes. You want to watch this very, very carefully. I'm not saying Rich wasn't giving you facts. I'm saying that it's a reflection of this administration that when it comes to words, there's an awful lot of fancy footwork. Finally, defense going up. It's not going up in real terms. It's going up in nominal terms. It's a big difference. And I come back to the point, why has this administration, given its own Secretary of Defense's concern, and remember, this is, the Pentagon follows the Commander-in-Chief's orders. I'm not surprised General Dempsey has said what he said. That's what chiefs do. Nevertheless, the Secretary of Defense is so agitated that he puts, not in a press conference, not in an open mic statement to somebody, but in an open letter, his concerns about the sequester. And this administration is prepared to hold defense hostage in order to further its ideological goals.
Just on that point, every administration official has actually spoken out against the sequester, so that is fully consistent.
Then you prove my point.
Well, no one supports the sequester. I think that's a point that you might have lost in the translation.
I'm not saying that Mr. Obama supports it, but he's prepared to sit on his hands, and sometimes no action is action. So
you're aware that the Senate Republican leader actually said that his number one goal was to stop the president's agenda and keep him from being reelected. Therefore, the notion that we're getting the kind of cooperation to stop the kind of sequester that you're concerned about is, I think, is a bit of a fictional account.
On the contrary, how many, look, if I don't care what Senator McConnell may or may not have said, if the president wants to stop the sequester, he needs to be calling people into the White House every day. This should be his number one concern. Instead, what you're getting is the Labor Department issuing confusing guidelines about the WARN Act, the administration saying they're going to cover contractors if they get sued by their employees, and Senator McCain saying that's against the law. That's what we're getting. We're getting fancy footwork, not the all-out pressure to get a deal that only the President of the United States can impose.
But perhaps the House chairman of the Budget Committee, who could be a heartbeat away from the presidency, also could have been against the sequester, but in fact he wasn't, and in fact spoke out in support of it.
We have other issues to get to as well. So
wait a minute, aren't you like Jim Lehrer?
I'm not going to comment on that. We do have other issues to get to, and I know that people will want to ask about issues like Asia, trade, Russia, things like that. So let's go to the audience now. We have microphones around the room. Please raise your hand if you'd like to be recognized, state your name and affiliation, make sure you're asking a question rather than a long statement, please. This lady right here.
My name is Megan Beats. I'm with EIR. And my question is for Mr. Verma. You said in the beginning of your statement that Al-Qaeda has been decimated, and you also said that, I forget your exact words, but the people of Libya are facing a much more free and optimistic situation than they did before the invasion into Libya. And I just want to raise a specter of something which was already raised earlier, which was the recent assassination of our ambassador in Benghazi. And just a couple of things to set up my question. Just after that, General Hayden wrote an article pinning the responsibility for the security situation, which led to the assassination, on the president's invasion of Libya, which, by the way, did not get congressional approval. Number two, on Capitol Hill today, Lieutenant Colonel Wood is testifying, who was part of the last security team in there, who said that he recommended increasing security because of the deteriorating situation in Benghazi. That didn't happen. He and his team were pulled out. The ambassador himself expressed his own fear and worry that he was being targeted. I could go on and on and on. The point is, the administration was forewarned. It would be completely incompetent to say that they had no clue that something like this was about to happen. Yet, when this did occur, Susan Rice and other spokesmen came out and said, this was spontaneous, we had no idea, we've got to look into it. So my question is, why should the American people, why would it be a better idea for the American people to vote to give this president another 4 years, rather than demanding a criminal investigation into the assassination in what's now being called Benghazi Gate?
So you might have a point of view that you were trying to express in the form of a question. Let me, where should I begin? There's so much to talk about. So Chris Stevens is really an American hero, and I think anyone who knew him and knew what he was trying to do there would agree with that. He went to Benghazi for a reason, because Benghazi is really where these kinds of battles take place. They are the battles between forces of extremism and forces of moderation. And newsflash, Benghazi is a very dangerous place. And he knew that, and the State Department knew that. And that's why the Secretary has appointed an accountability review board. That's why they're doing these investigations to see if the right decisions were taken. But let me also tell you what happened after the ambassador was killed. Tens of thousands of people marched in the streets of Benghazi, and they said with signs, Chris Stevens is our friend. They overran the militias. The president of Libya ordered all militias to be shut down. This is a country going through an incredibly difficult time. From the premise of your question, it sounds as if you would rather have supported Gaddafi still being there. The fact is, without American leadership, Gaddafi would still be there. And we were principal part of leading that effort. And we are a principal part of ensuring and supporting the moderate forces in Libya. Now, with regard to the investigation, you can take the threads that you want to take. You can try to make it into a political matter, as the governor tried to do, hours after a tragedy. After they had already bungled the press release the night before, he decided to go out the next morning. Now, there is something about judgment and temperament of a future commander-in-chief. When even your political advisors force you out to the podium, you might have enough restraint to say no. This is not the right time. We actually don't know all the facts. It turns out he actually knows one of the deceased. Mentioned that on the campaign trail yesterday. Had he known facts like that, maybe he wouldn't have rushed out to the podium. The fact is, his position has been everywhere. You look at the 5 or 6 positions he's had on Libya. I'm not sure what it is people would have done differently. It is critically important we support people like that. Our diplomats are at risk every day. They are at risk in dangerous parts of the world. And frankly, the House Republican Budget Committee has struck State Department funding many times over for department security. I hope in the course of the investigation that's a fact that's looked at as well. But judgment calls made by diplomats, made by patriots about security situations, when the military is not there with them, and these are very difficult situations. And so I would not prejudge the facts until the full investigation is done. And frankly, everything that has been said thus far has been based on the information available at the time. And it is a very, very difficult situation to get facts from a place like Benghazi on the night of a very tragic attack. I have no doubt that the facts will continue to evolve, and that as we get more clarity, there will be more definitive statements. But it sounds like you and the governor, and frankly other people, would rather make a political case out of this.
I think that's unfair to the questioner. First of all, the first statements weren't made by the governor. The first statement was made by an administration official who blamed it on a video. And the American embassy in Egypt, which was what the governor was criticizing, had essentially said, look, this video is terrible, but we've got to be, we have to be respectful of all religions. Although, quite frankly, I have not heard the administration come out and say that those who abuse Buddhist temples, burn Sikh temples, abuse Jewish history, persecute Christians, should also be held equally accountable. I have not heard that. This was really a teachable moment, by the way. This was a time when Mr. Obama could have said, look, what this video is about is wrong, but guess what? There are things that are being done in the Muslim world that are also wrong, and Islamic speakers don't speak out. Their leaders don't speak out, their mullahs don't speak out, not loudly enough, not enough of them. There are many courageous ones who do, but certainly not enough of them. But this wasn't about the video at all. That's the whole point. It was about Al-Qaeda. And that has come out. That's coming out in the testimony this morning. It's come out before already. But the administration did not want to admit it was Al-Qaeda, because that would mean we have not destroyed Al-Qaeda. I don't care if it's Al-Qaeda Central or Al-Qaeda franchises. That's like saying, gee, you know, McDonald's isn't really selling hamburgers except in San Diego. I don't count all the franchises all over the country and all over the world. What difference does it make if it's an Al-Qaeda franchise or Al-Qaeda Central or a terrorist group by some other name? This dancing around issues is just so frustrating, not for me, not for Governor Romney, but for the world, for our friends, for those who depend on us.
All right. Other questions? Yes, sir, right here.
I'm Dave Stafford, and for 30 years I worked for Northrop Grumman. I retired recently. My question goes to this issue of the Navy, and it does appear to most that in an information age, our carrier battle groups are far more capable than they were in an industrial age. But at a different level, numbers matter. And it seems to me that if you have 10 or 11 carrier battle groups, you're only going to deploy 3 or 4 at any given time. So I'm not quite sure what the argument is when you say you need to increase the Navy size, and the other side says, we've got adequate forces. It doesn't seem to jive if you want to carry all of the Pacific as your new pivot strategy, that you're only going to have 2 or 3 carriers deployed at any given moment. Could some of you comment on this?
Well, as you know very well, and anybody who knows naval forces very well, if you want to have a carrier in the Middle East, it's going to take you 5 or 6 to support it. So just run up the numbers. You want to have carriers in the Pacific, 1 carrier is stationed in Japan, in Yokosuka, so the calculation is about 1.15 carriers to support it. Any other carrier in the Western Pacific will take 4 to 5. How are you going to have two carriers in the Western Pacific and 2 more in the Indian Ocean? And oh, by the way, what about the Eastern Mediterranean? It doesn't add up. It just doesn't add up. And that's just carriers. What about escorts? What about submarines? You just play the numbers. Yes, they are more capable, but carriers and ships generally don't fly. Aircraft fly. And if you want to have a naval presence, which is what the State Department historically has always called upon whenever there's been a crisis, the ones who say send the carriers are always our diplomats, because they know the diplomatic value of naval forces. If that's what you want, if that's what you need, this administration's program is not going to hack it.
I would just say, repeat something I said earlier, which is, the Navy is going to grow under this administration. Our Navy is already bigger than the next 13 navies combined. We're on track to have 300 ships by FY 20. But you have to balance that in terms of what the threats are we're actually trying to deter and defeat. And you have to have a balanced approach to your defense posture. If you look at the strategy that Secretary Panetta put out in January of 2012, where he listed the areas which were going to be priorities for the administration: counterterrorism and irregular warfare, cybersecurity, keeping the sea lanes open, countering WMD. And there are a lot of threats, and we're trying to balance that within the fiscal reality. And the fact is, the capabilities and the technologies on our ships are better than they've ever before, and they are the best in the world, and they'll remain that way.
Okay. Yes, sir, right here.
Thanks. Good afternoon. I'm Patrick Wilson. I'm an Iraq veteran. I watched with interest the drawdown in Iraq from very, very close, the transition to New Dawn and the end of that period. So most recently, I've watched the boxes turn red in Afghanistan. Forgive me, I'm a veteran of an infantry battalion. I'm a lieutenant. We make slides. And on the slides, commanders want to know, make the boxes green, Lieutenant. What I see in Afghanistan, the most recent reports, is everything the Army has said about the quote-unquote progress of our surge in Afghanistan, all the boxes are red. My question is, if you're looking back to the Iraq conflict, if that surge had gone as badly as it now appears the surge has gone in Afghanistan, where would the political fallout be? Because I'm frustrated not about the political debate, but how little discussion there is anywhere in the media about the fact that Afghanistan, apparently the surge there, the soldiers we sacrificed, the blood and treasure we put there, has all been for naught. And I'm wondering in the political context what that means for both accountability for the White House and obviously what Governor Romney hopes to do about it.
Well, first, let me thank you for your service. And I would agree with you, there's not enough discussion about these issues, about Afghanistan, frankly, and the troops that we have there. And there wasn't enough discussion about what was happening in Iraq as well. Look, it's a very difficult situation in Afghanistan. It has been well before we got there, and it will continue to be a difficult situation. The fact is, what is the strategy to try to get the Afghan government in a place and the Afghan military where it can actually defend itself, where we can weaken the Taliban nexus to extremism? And that is exactly what the strategy is built around, which is trying to use combination of force and building of institutions in Afghanistan and trying to support civil society and other elements to try to give it the chance. The Afghans are very anxious to try to take the lead from the United States, which is why these transition plans are so important, which apparently there is very little difference in, and why the strategic partnership agreement that the president entered into is so critical. We do have an enduring interest in having an enduring presence in Afghanistan. The president has made that very clear. And I don't think anyone would, I mean, you know better than anyone how difficult this is going to be, how difficult it's been. The question is, do we have the right strategy and try the mix of political and military and of tools that are required to see this thing through with our ISAF partners. And so we are going to be at this beyond the transition point at the end of 2014 through different functions, supporting the Afghan military and security forces the best we can.
Well, first of all, I agree. Thank you for your service. It's really rough to be out there. I know too many people who've come back not in one piece, and some who've come back in body bags. So I do thank you. The difficulty is, as those of us who support the governor and as the governor himself has made clear, is that by coming up with a fixed deadline, we have sent the wrong signals to our adversaries. Now remember, we're constantly being told, President Bush said we'd pull out of Iraq as well. But there was going to be a SOFA, a Status of Forces Agreement. And then the White House didn't push very hard. Again, if that was really important, the president should have been on the phone to Maliki every single day. He wasn't. And so you got the situation where we were out. Yes, we have a civilian presence on the ground, but you see that that's not doing the job. I don't envy John Allen one bit. He has a very tough job as commander out there, and he's a brilliant guy, and he'll do it as well as anybody I know. But again, how do you deal with the fact that already some of our allies have been talking about and have started pulling troops out because of this deadline? How do you deal with the Taliban's behavior because of this deadline? The big difference, I reiterate, between Mr. Obama and Mr. Romney is that Mr. Romney says he will consult the folks in uniform, which opens the door to the possibility that we're not going to pull out in 2014 if the situation doesn't warrant it. Now, if the situation warrants it, of course we'll pull out. Why should we stay one extra day? Why should we risk our kids' lives one more minute if we can get out? But if our commanders, if the General Allens of this world turn around and say, not yet, Governor Romney is not locked into pulling out. That is a huge difference. And if those boxes continue to be read, as you say, then maybe our generals are going to say, we need a little more time.
All right. Let's see. This lady right here.
Hi, my name is Asuka. I'm a political researcher. My question is for both speakers, but I referenced the opening remark by Mr. Zakheim saying that you both agree on the objective, but the difference is how we're going to go about it. Now, I totally think that really described the situation very well, because going back to, thinking about the last two administrations, I think there are real agreements from both sides, Republican and Democrat, on bailout policy. It was continued. Cutting the budget despite the fact that the majority of American citizens are, going under. Also, continuation of war policy, which, we're debating here, but for different reasons, different ways, this war have continued under both Democratic and Republican presidency. And also, I will reference the cover-up of 9/11. George Bush presidency covered up the 9/11 document, especially 28 pages document on Saudi Arabia.
Move your question, please?
Yeah, sure. And then cover up the new 9/11 just happened. So my question is, okay, seems to me that both parties have agreed upon objective, but my question is, what is really objective here? Because I don't think it's to bring down our nation. And I really think if we agree to bring back our nation back, there are some, policies that are just no-brainer. Glass-Steagall, issue credit to industry.
I think we got that one.
But what is the objective? And I want two speakers to address that.
Let's take one more question in addition to that, right next door.
Rich Mark Kimmett. It was very interesting during the 2008 campaign how the president said, the then candidate Obama said, we need to end the war in Iraq so we can win the war in Afghanistan. That's the one we've got to win. But as soon as he came into office, he went from the narrative of winning the war in Afghanistan to ending the war in Afghanistan. Can you tell me where this policy shift went from winning to ending? Because when you start talking about your objective being ending a war rather than winning a war, it appears to me that it sends a message not only to our adversaries, but our friends that we're not serious about the mission. So if you could address that, it'd be very helpful.
Sure, and thank you for your many years of service as well. Look, the fact is, the Afghan campaign has gone on for 11, 12 years, and it was very important in the president's mind to set inflection point, a transition point to focus the Afghanis on taking responsibility, or else it would be a perpetual state of affairs where we could have 100,000 troops there and provide security indefinitely. That is not what the American people want or expect, and frankly, it's not in our long-term national security interest to have that number of troops bogged down there when we can train an Afghan force to do the job. It is their country. They are a sovereign government. They need to do the job. As I said, I think it's very important, and I'm sure you know this, the Strategic Partnership Agreement does not suggest an absence of the United States. In fact, it suggests just the opposite. It suggests an enduring partnership, an enduring relationship with security responsibilities. We clearly have interests in the region in keeping the Afghans from becoming a safe haven for terror again. And so that's what the policy is about. And I'm really focused on the president's words when he talks about a transition at the end of 2014 to focus the Afghan leadership, of which they are very anxious to take over security responsibilities, and we need to make sure that they're ready.
I would just say, if the president's speech in December of 2009 had said, We want to train the forces. We want to have a strategic partnership agreement, and left it at that, we'd be in a totally different situation. By saying as well, we're getting out by date certain, he created the mess we're in my view. Now let me deal with this lady's question. You're absolutely right. Rich and I agree on the national security objectives of our country. We have different ways of going about it. We both agree we've got to fight terrorism. We both agree that we have interests and allies abroad. We both agree that our forces should be deployed forward. We both agree that we need to provide the best for our troops. And by the way, we both agree that there was no 9/11 conspiracy. I don't know where you came up with that paper, but let me tell you, send it to the New York Times. I'm sure they'll print it up, and then we'll see what people say about it. The biggest problem we have are those folks like you who bought this nonsense. It's not him, it's not me, it's not his president, it's not my governor. No responsible person was involved in any 9/11 conspiracy. And it is an insult to the leaders of our country to say that. And I'm sorry to bang on you, but I have to tell you, it's an insult to the dead as well.
All right. This lady right here.
Hi, I'm Christy Kaufman. I'm the Executive Director of the Coda Support Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to bridging the civilian-military divide. I'm also an 11-year Army wife. So my question really is for anybody on the panel. We as a country have basically outsourced 2 wars over 10 years to less than 1% of the population. And I don't think that this is a myopic question, although I do have skin in the game. We've done a really good job at doing what you guys have asked us to do. Whatever party has asked us to do it. My question is in regards to national service in general. Is this not something that any candidate will ever take on? You don't necessarily have to wear a uniform to serve, but I tell you, we're pretty tired after doing this for 10 years with so few of us, and we're talking about the different budgets, the different, going up, going down. But in the end, it seems like if more of America had skin in the game, and I don't want to get into the draft question, but I really wish that both the candidates would address this issue of national service so that we can all feel like we've been at war, because I'll tell you, it doesn't feel like that to us.
I'll take it first. I can't speak for the governor on this. I'll speak personally. I've served my country for about 15 years. Never came out ahead financially when I was doing it. I have a son that serves my country right now, not in uniform, but on the Hill. He's a lawyer. He could make at least 5 times as much. I've got another son who served his town, and it was really hard trying to keep a family together while you're serving on the city council. I totally agree with you that we all need to play a part in serving our country. It starts, I think, with people like yourself speaking out more. I think we need to, again, I'm speaking personally here, I think we need to get more and more people to be conscious of the fact that, Kennedy was right. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Sometimes Democrats are right.
Maybe we should end it there.
I said sometimes. So I would say that your point is a very important one, and I certainly personally would hope that anybody who's watching this pays attention to your concerns, because being a military wife is no less easy than serving in the military. I know I've been working with the military for more than 35 years. I have friends who lost their husbands, had to bring up kids on their own. I have other friends, many Navy and Marine Corps friends, that spend months on end paying the bills, dealing with the kids, doing the carpool, taking care of the house, working the job, morning to night, 24/7. There is no end. And then, God forbid, if somebody comes home without an arm, a leg, a stomach, an eye, or whatever. So you've got Dov Zakheim's 100% support.
Let me also just thank you again for your family's service, and I echo everything that Dov said. And you know, President has taken every opportunity he can to support the military, to meet with military veterans, those that return, those that are there. You know, I do think it raises a larger question, however, and it is about what we ask our military to do. And I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that was kind of at the heart of your question, which is you've done a lot over the last decade, and people are now asking you to do more. Don't they know kind of what it's like to pick up and leave kids for a year and leave spouses for multiple rotations? And I think that is a real difference between the two approaches to foreign policy and defense. And let me try to explain it this way, in that the president's approach is about using all elements of our power, diplomatic power, using our development tools, using our military, using our intelligence assets, using homeland defense, using advanced technologies, so that we don't think that every solution, every problem has a military solution attached to it. And I do think that it's a difference in the speeches, it's a difference in the budget priorities, it's a difference in the rhetoric that the two candidates talk about. And it's a difference, frankly, in the budget that Congressman Ryan put together. And I know, you know, budgets take months to put together. They take a lot of thought and deliberation, and the thought and deliberation that went into his national security blueprint for America said the military is going to solve all of our national security problems. And that was the approach in the previous administration. I am not looking back. What I'm doing is seizing upon ideas that have been brought forward by your team. And I think there is a real difference. And I think that is exactly what happened in the prior 8 years. We put the burdens of the country's security on the backs of men and women in uniform without looking at other tools of American power as well. And I think the president's approach is more balanced.
Well, I think, frankly, if you follow the president's approach and you cut defense, you're going to wind up going to war more often. You don't go to war when people think you're strong. You go to war when people think you're weak. If you look at President Reagan's buildup, and you look at the buildup that continued under President Clinton, yeah, we were involved in what you might call skirmishes, but we weren't involved in long-term wars. And so I would argue, not that Mr. Romney is against using every tool of our power. On the contrary, he is. That's why he's concerned about the loopholes in sanctions, for example. Precisely because he says, let's use the tools we've got and avoid having to use the military more than we need to, and frankly, avoid having to use them at all if we can get away with it. But you're not going to convince your enemies if you are weak. Why did North Korea attack South Korea in 1950? Because we announced that South Korea was outside our security perimeter, and oh, by the way, we cut our forces by a tremendous percentage, and the North Koreans concluded we weren't interested. Why did the Argentines invade the Falkland Islands in the 80s? Because the Brits cut back on their forces. Cutting back on your strength invites the exact thing you want to avoid.
All right, yes, this lady in red back here.
Hi, Jennifer Alton with Bavarian Nordic. I was wondering if each of you could comment on the threat that you see the U.S. facing from bioterrorism, and what, if anything, you think we should be doing to counter that threat. Thank you.
So, I mean, I'll talk from personal experience here. I was on the Weapons of Mass Destruction Commission to prevent terrorism, this WMD Terror Commission, and the shocking conclusion that the commission found was that the threat from bioterrorism was actually greater in terms of the short-term threat than even nuclear and chemical weapons. And so the recommendations that came out of that commission, which the president has adopted many of them, about securing biofacilities around the world, about working with scientists from different countries that produce biotoxins, There is a very comprehensive diplomatic effort on securing biological weapons and precursors. It is a big issue. It's a serious issue, and I think the administration has taken it seriously. But make no mistake, it's a very serious issue.
I would simply say that one of the conclusions is we haven't done enough, and I don't think the program reflects that we've done enough. We need to do more. There's no question about it. I think there's a consensus on that.
All right, we have time for one last question. I'm going to go to this gentleman right here in the front.
First of all, thank you for providing this forum. It's an amazing forum, a great group of people you put together here today. My name is Scott Ricard. I'm a former NSA linguist and also a U.S. Air Force linguist. I've served my country for quite a long time, and I will tell you that the country needs a big reality check. Very disingenuous to say that Reagan was a peaceful president. He fought 2 wars that I covered very closely against Iran. In another war I covered very closely against the best way to fight your enemy is to use an enemy, and that's what we did with Saddam, and that's also what we did with guys like the folks in Afghanistan and in Pakistan against the Russians. We fought the Russians for 10 years as well. So that's very disingenuous. In fact, my question is, how can we continue to survive as a country? In my lifetime, I'm 50 years old this year. We've murdered over 25 million people in this world and lost less than 100,000 in battle. And 58,000 of those were in Vietnam. Now the fact is that we are a far more warring nation than any other nation on the history of this planet. We've killed more people, and we've done some terrible things around the world. And I really feel it's disingenuous to sit in front of a crowd and mislead them about the kind of nation that we've become. We've got more weapons of mass destruction. We provided mustard gas in the 80s to Saddam Hussein. The reason we didn't find weapons of mass destruction there is because they had stamp made in the USA on them, and we destroyed them. That's a fact.
Thank you. And you might want to wrap in any other comments you'd like to make as a wrap-up, as we'll go to each of you, and maybe we can start with Dov and go in reverse order that we started with. Sure.
Well, you know, everybody's entitled to their opinion. You may have been in the middle of our shipping mustard gas to Saddam. You may have been in the middle of our killing 25 million people. That's not the country I know. It's as simple as that. And it's not the country I've served. I would say this. It's true, we supplied the Afghan rebels. No doubt about it. But they were doing the fighting. And if we helped Saddam against the Iranians, he was doing the fighting. So I stand by what I said. We sent troops into Grenada. It wasn't exactly a 10-year-old battle. We actually pulled ourselves out of Lebanon. So I stand by what I said about Mr. Reagan. I don't believe that we are the evil empire. Maybe you do. And I really do believe that our country, whoever is president, has its heart in the right place. And I'll give you the proof of the pudding. Whether Mr. Obama is president, Mr. Romney is president, whoever's president, I don't see people migrating out of this country. They all want to come here. If we were so terrible, they would be going to Russia and China and God knows where else. But since the 18th century, your ancestors, my ancestors, his ancestors, everybody here's ancestors have all been coming here. We're a good country, not a bad one.
Rich.
So let me thank you again for giving us the opportunity. And, I just think, look, I'm very proud to be here, as I said, on behalf of the President, because I think the record over the last 4 years on foreign policy and security is a good one. And there are real differences. I think you heard many of them today. And the question is, what kind of vision do we want for the future? And who is best suited to keep America secure? The President said that's his #1 responsibility, is to keep the American people safe and secure. And I do think the more comprehensive approach that the President has laid forward, using all the tools of American power, working with our allies, rebuilding international institutions, rebuilding our alliances, and ultimately acting when it's in the U.S. interest to act and protecting the country. The President has a strong record on that front. And I think, you know, I'm not going to rehash what we just covered over the last 90 minutes, but I do think there are real differences, and I think the president has a very strong record, and unfortunately, I think the governor would take us back to a place that we had left from.
Well, thank you, Rich, and thank you, Dov, both for very ably representing your candidates here. Thank you to all you for coming. Thanks to Tom and Peter, and please join me in thanking our representatives for being here today.